one of the series that I missed out on the PlayStation that sort of originally launched on the PS1 era, PS1 was the Legacy of Kain games, and Blood Omen was. There's a long history of these games. There's a ton of these games, and they kind of weave back and forth between all of them. Legacy of Kain, and then Soul Reaver, that sort of sub series. There's Blood Omen and Soul Reaver. They're kind of these two sub series that are kind of thematically and character tied and all that kind of stuff because of Kain, who's a vampire. Um, and then they've made other stuff since then. I never played any of those games. So when I found out that they had announced the Soul Reaver games, I thought, oh, like a remaster. I'm like, you know what? I'd heard so much of these games. Let me give them a shot. Um, and yeah, so I decided I'm going to review Soul Reaver, the remasters. Grab those codes, and I've been reviewing it on Switch. And it's interesting because the Switch has really become sort of my retro console for like playing a lot of those games. I play the Tomb Raider remasters, which controls, again, we need to really modernize controls on all these games that are being remastered and remade, because stuff has changed a lot. Technology's changed. How we interface with games has changed. Going back to a lot of this stuff is difficult, and for me, it's as difficult as having to press select on old NES games instead of the up and down arrows on the D-pad. If I have to press select to select stuff in menus, just to scroll through a menu and then start to enter, that throws me off. We are way past that. That stuff should be fixed immediately in all these remasters. Tomb Raider didn't do a great job of it. Still really weird tank controls, even when you tried to play with quality of life stuff. You can go to a previous episode and hear my thoughts on that. But the Legacy of Kain games, because they were sort of the tail end of the PlayStation 1 era, so analog sticks were starting to come to prevalence, and obviously it had gone into the PS2 era. Both the Soul Reaver games, they were a little further ahead. There's still some stuff that I'll get into here in a second, but they were far enough ahead where remastering them, you didn't have to do a lot of unnecessary things to bring them up to speed. You still have to do some stuff, but it's not like a wholesale rebuild of these games. So Soul Reaver 1 and 2, they are announced, the remaster, they come out. Like I said, I never played these games before. Back in those 90s, I was into RPGs and party games and FPS games. I'd kind of fallen out of the action stuff. I always knew they're highly regarded. I just thought I'd kind of miss them, and I was never going to get back to them. So yeah, remasters come out. I'm like, okay, finally, this is the moment. I'll hop into these games. Let's do this, and I'm glad I did, because they're pretty good. They still hold up. There are issues, but they still hold up. So games from this era, we're still trying to figure out what is sort of good cohesive action in 3D, right? In action adventure games in 3D, they had nailed the 2D stuff, but moving into 3D, everybody was still trying to understand what the end users really wanted, what the gamers really wanted. And so because of the hardware of the time, the games, they weren't always the fastest. Hardware couldn't keep up with it. They had to do tricks for like loading and shifting from area to area. And they obviously weren't the most fluid because you had minimal controls. So that, like I said, that late PS1, early PS2 era was still sort of finding its place. That said, like, there are definite differences between these two games. They've improved both of them, but you can tell that Soul Reaver 2 was out later, and I think it was only a couple years later when it initially released, because it managed to get into that PS2 era, which you were always using analog controls at that time, and the hardware was much more powerful, and you could do a lot more things. So they're sort of an interweaving narrative. But these are out of the whole Legacy of Kain series, like I said, but these are the two that sort of stick out. And this was some of Amy Hennig's best, like, early directorial work. I think that was she this sort of launched her career in the public space among the gaming industry. Notoriety, I guess, as people really found out, like, hey, these are really fascinating stories. So when we replay classic games like this, they don't always feel great by modern standards. I kind of mentioned that before. While these are they have aged, they actually still are good to play. The biggest issue is that they're just not as fluid as I want them to be. This is my first time ever playing these games, so I'm coming at them really fresh, and I'm playing them as if they're being released today. Not as fluid, not as fast. There's loading issues. There's action and attack issues. The first game is they're not. Neither of these are unplayable, but the first game is a lot rougher in it and how it was put together. As a new player, though, I definitely like both of these. They're, like I said, they're notoriously linked because of how that first game ends. You can read up on that. There's a big cliffhanger, but they're different enough that they function well as sort of these unique experiences, right? So if you don't really fall in love with the first game, like I wasn't in love with the first game, I played enough of it to really kind of get the gist of what it was and what they had improved. It's the second game, Soul Reaver 2, that I thought was, okay, that's this. They got it right. So both these games let us sort of unlock abilities and weapons as we progress, which is really good because that first game starts out really slow. And if you've played the Legacy of Kain or the Soul Reaver series, you know that, like, you're starting off with these really up close melee attacks, and it's not till you start unlocking abilities and weapons and stuff. And that takes a tiny little bit of grinding and time to get to that point. It's much quicker in Soul Reaver 2. The battle action in that first game isn't quite fun early on, but like I said, you get enough upgrades finally, and it opens up into something kind of interesting. I just didn't love doing the environmental kills in that first game because the aiming, again, the whole control issue, the aiming wasn't nailed down yet, and so it made it kind of difficult to get those environmental kills. And there are environmental kills with a lot of the different enemies, so you can sort of suck the soul out of their body easier and take them out easier. But I felt like they were, in a way, presented pretty well from that standpoint. So speaking of presenting, I thought I had clicked the button so you guys can see the video anywhere. Here we go. I'll play this video right here. Let it loop in the background. So yeah, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it from that standpoint. Except for the environmental kills. But yeah, once you start opening stuff up, you get those neat combos. These are pretty good. And you also kind of have to learn how to lock on. That was a little bit of a pain, locking on with these games, because, again, controllers have changed, and it's supposed to be a lot easier. It should be a lot easier to lock on in modern games. And if you approach these as if they're modern games, you have to take a step back a little bit, because they weren't, there's quality of life improvements, but they're still holding true to the original core of those games. And in this case, it's that gameplay mechanic, which is Raziel, kind of the lead character in the Soul Reaver series, his ability to sort of shift back and forth between these planes of existence and stuff, and how to solve puzzles related to that aspect. So, and it's kind of cool. In that first game, though, I did kind of find myself getting stuck a couple of times, even early on, because there's not a lot of like signage or markers to explain to do what's next. So you are sort of figuring things out, which is interesting from an action adventure standpoint. They don't do a lot of hand holding. Just very talky. There's a lot of narrative aspect of it, but they don't do a lot of hand holding. So they kind of expect you to figure out the lay of the land by yourself. And speaking of the lay of the land, the first game is a little more traditional. Beat a level, and there's a boss at the end. Go to the next level, there's a boss in, and there's a kind of a hub in between, but the levels sort of play out the same way. There's always this boss at the end. The second game really kind of pushes that concept a little further and focuses more on the narrative side. So you may have a level that has sort of traditional gates along the way, but it's designed in a way that it's the story pulling you along, as opposed to the confines of typical level design. So I thought that was kind of neat. You know, that was really neat actually. Great plot, by the way. The second game, both games kind of tell that story. You know, of Raziel. He's banished by Kain because he became too powerful, and so he got resurrected. He's out for revenge. Yada yada. Visual wise, they're really clean. There's new texture maps, better resolution. Does look like they cleaned up the originals, like as opposed to wholly recreating polygons and models, and I appreciate that. Again, these are remastered versions of the older games. They want you to, especially for collectors and folks who are nostalgic, to jump into these and be like, oh yeah, now I remember. This is why I love these games, and there's, you know, I want to replay those originals, and they've really stayed true to that. Instead of, like I said, instead of rebuilding whole levels and whole areas. That being said, they did include a lot of cool cut stuff that was removed from the game. That's kind of put back in there, which is kind of cool. There's a really nice gallery with concept art. There's fan art in there, character designs, and it even kind of includes outtakes from the recording sessions. And that was really fun to watch. Just a really neat idea. I love that kind of aspect. So you're watching the video of people doing these outtakes as they're doing the voiceovers and the audio and stuff. So yeah, it functions well on Switch. I got to say, I should mention that part. Very few times that I get annoyed by like light frame rate dips, but more than anything else, it was just the camera control and the camera design, the camera positioning that was getting in my way. It's kind of hard to judge how the camera was going to react if I was moving in one direction. Again, you're staying true to the classic gameplay. I understand that you don't always have to be 100% true to that era. I think, like I said, things have moved on, and that may affect the gameplay, though. You know, once you start doing that. So, yeah, it's a solid package for folks who are trying to get into them for the first time. Like I said, you may want to go into this knowing that they're not modern games; they're just sort of cleaned up versions of those originals, and that's fine. Like I am, you know, I think they're fine games, you know, for the first time. And all the extra stuff is great for folks who are fans of those games the first time around, because content, like I said, there's the art, there's the audio stuff. It's kind of a compelling package for fans. So it's a worthwhile pickup of a, you know, well-regarded series. Yeah. How I know people liked it. I put plenty of hours into both these games now, to safely say that I can appreciate the Soul Reaver games even more than I ever did. So kudos to them.